I was supposed to be in the waiting room, flowers in hand, ready to meet my first grandchild. Instead, the hospital porter whispered, "Ma'am, please get behind that curtain, right now. Don't make a sound." And before I could ask a single question, he pulled the curtain closed around me, and everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law began to unravel. Thank you so much for being here with me today. Before I continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? Drop your city in the comments below, and if this story speaks to your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. One last thing, this story blends real emotions with some fictionalized details for storytelling purposes. But the lessons inside? Those are as real as anything I've ever lived through. The morning my grandson was born, I woke up early. Too early. 4:30. The sky still dark over our little town of Guelph, Ontario, the kind of quiet that sits on you like a wool blanket. I lay there in the bed I'd shared with my husband Douglas for 31 years, the same bed I'd slept in alone for the past 4, and I told myself the flutter in my chest was excitement, a grandmother's nerves, nothing more. My son, my Matthew, had called me the night before. His voice was bright and breathless. "Mum, Carla's contractions are 6 minutes apart. We're going to the hospital in the morning. You'll come, right?" "You'll be there?" Of course I'd be there. I was already ironing my blouse when he called. I'd picked out the flowers the day before, pale yellow tulips, because Matthew once told me Carla loved them, and I'd wrapped a little stuffed bear in craft paper for the baby. I'd knitted a blanket over the past 7 months in soft gray wool, folded it carefully into a gift bag. I was ready. I'd been ready since the moment Matthew called to say Carla was pregnant. I want to be fair about this. I want you to understand that I tried, from the very beginning, to love Carla the way a mother-in-law should. She was poised and careful, always said the right things at the right moments. She remembered to ask about my garden. She brought a bottle of Ontario Riesling to our first dinner together. She looked at Matthew like he was something rare and worth keeping. But there was something behind her eyes that I could never quite name. Douglas used to say, I saw shadows where there were none. I went to when and he'd tell me, when to waiting is a warning sign, and I'd nod and tuck the feeling away and pour us both another cup of tea. Douglas died 4 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. And after he was gone, it was just me and Matthew, my quiet, earnest, generous Matthew, who missed his father in the same deep, wordless way I did. Carla came into his life 8 months after the funeral. Matthew said they met at a fundraiser for the food bank downtown. She'd volunteered. She'd seemed passionate about it. He came home from that evening with color in his cheeks for the first time in months. I didn't ask too many questions. I watched. And I waited. They dated for 14 months. Moved in together. Got engaged at Christmas. Right there in my living room, Matthew down on one knee with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Carla cried. I cried too. I told myself that meant something. The wedding was quiet. 30 guests at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Beautiful. Everything perfectly arranged. Carla had planned every detail herself. She didn't want input, she said sweetly, because she didn't want to put anyone out. I accepted that. I told myself it was her wedding, her day, and then, 7 months ago, she called me to say she was pregnant, due in late November. I threw myself into grandmothering before the baby had even arrived. I painted the spare room in my house soft yellow, just in case they ever needed to stay. I bought 4 parenting books not to give advice, just to understand. I knitted that blanket. I signed up for a baby first aid course at the rec center. I was going to be the grandmother Douglas would have been proud of. The porter's name was Gerald. I only know that because I'd seen his name tag in the hallway outside the maternity ward. Just before he stepped in front of me so fast, I nearly dropped my tulips. I'd arrived at Guelph General at 8:45 in the morning. Matthew had texted at 8 to say Carla was 7 centimeters along. Everything going well. The nurse at the front desk recognized me. I'd been there the week before for a pre-admission tour and buzzed me through without question. I walked down the corridor toward the room Matthew had described, room 14, second door past the nursing station. But before I reached it, Gerald appeared, moving with a quiet urgency that reminded me of someone trying not to cause a scene. "Mrs. Hartwell?" he said low. Eleanor Hartwell? I stopped. Yes? He glanced over his shoulder at room 14. The door was slightly ajar, voices inside, two of them, not Matthew's. Please, he said, come with me, just for a moment. Something in the way he said it, not alarmed, but careful, the way you speak to someone when you're afraid of what they might do if they hear bad news too fast, made me follow him without argument. He led me to a small family alcove just around the corner, half-curtained, with 2 chairs and a side table and a box of tissues nobody had opened. He pulled the curtain most of the way closed. He looked at me steadily. Your son, Gerald said, asked me to keep an eye on you when you arrived. I frowned. Matthew? Why? Is something wrong with the baby? The baby is fine. He hesitated. Your son is fine too. He had to step out to get a coffee. He didn't know you'd arrive before he got back. Another pause. Mrs. Hartwell, there's a man in room 14 right now. He came in about 20 minutes ago. He told the nursing staff he was the father. The room went very quiet. Or maybe it was just my mind, slowing everything down the way it does when something too large is trying to get in. I'm sorry, I said. A man claiming to be Matthew is the father. Gerald looked at me with a steadiness that told me he had delivered hard news before. This man gave a different name. He was very insistent. He said Gerald chose his words carefully. He said he'd been trying to reach the mother for weeks, that they had unfinished business, that he had rights. I sat down in one of the chairs. I didn't plan to. My legs simply made the decision for me. Douglas, I thought, I need you right now. Gerald gave me 30 seconds. Then he said gently, your son doesn't know yet. He left before this man arrived. I didn't want to call him and cause an accident if he was driving. I thought when I saw you coming down the hall, I thought you should know first. I looked up at him. Who is this man? Gerald handed me a folded piece of paper, a name, written in ballpoint pen. Someone at the nursing station had taken it down when he came in. Ryan Calloway. I didn't know that name. I had never heard Carla mention it. Not once. In 2 years of dinners and holidays and conversations in my kitchen. But the feeling that had lived in my chest since the day I met her, the shadow Douglas said, I imagined suddenly had a shape. I need to see, I said quietly. Gerald nodded. There's a supply room with a window that looks onto the corridor outside room 14. You can see who goes in and out. But Mrs. Hartwell, he looked at me carefully. Please don't go in until your son is back. Whatever's happening in that room, Matthew should hear it with you beside him, not after the fact. It was sound advice. I thanked him, and I followed him to the supply room, and I waited. The window was small, meant for staff to pass linens through, not for mothers-in-law to conduct surveillance, but it gave me a clear sightline to the door of room 14. Gerald had propped it open 2 inches, with a folded paper towel. The man who came out 7 minutes later was in his late 30s. Dark jacket, good shoes, the kind of composed bearing that comes either from confidence or from practice. He wasn't agitated. That's what I noticed first. He wasn't rushing or anxious or guilty looking. He stood outside that door like a man who believed he had every right to be there. He made a phone call. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I watched his face. He nodded twice. He said something that looked like I told you the shape of it on his mouth, and then he smiled, not warmly, the way someone smiles when a plan is coming together. My hand found the window ledge. Gerald touched my arm. Your son just texted. He's coming up from the lobby. 2 minutes. I was already moving toward the door. Matthew came around the corner carrying a coffee in each hand, a paper bag under his arm, and the look of a man who had never once in 34 years expected the world to be cruel to him. He saw my face and stopped. Mum? He looked around. What are you doing over here? Is everything? Where's Carla? Is the baby? The baby is fine, I said. I took one of the coffees gently from his hand so he'd have something to hold. Matthew, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it completely before we go into that room. Can you do that for me? He stared at me. My son has Douglas's eyes, the same gray, the same way of going very still when something frightens him. Mum, he said, what happened? Gerald came and stood a quiet distance away, close enough if we needed him, far enough to give us privacy. And I told Matthew everything Gerald had told me. Slowly, clearly. The name. The claim. The nursing staff. The man standing outside that door like he owned the right to be there. Matthew said nothing for a long time. His coffee went untouched. He looked at the floor, then at room 14, then at me. She wouldn't, he said finally. Not angry. Just trying to hold the world in the shape he'd always known it. I don't know what she would or wouldn't do, I said carefully. What I know is that a man named Ryan Calloway walked into your wife's labor room and told the hospital staff he was the father of her baby, and we need to find out why. Matthew stood very straight. Douglas used to do the same thing, pull himself up when something was hard, as though gravity could be argued with. Okay, he said quietly, okay, let's go in. Carla was in the bed, propped up against pillows, the baby not yet arrived. She was pale and exhausted, and when Matthew walked through the door, she reached for him immediately, her hand outstretched, her voice soft. You're back. I was wondering. She stopped when she saw my face. Matthew stood at the foot of the bed. He set down the coffees on the side table with more care than the moment required. He was buying himself a second to breathe. Carla, he said. His voice was very quiet. Who is Ryan Calloway? The room went absolutely still. Not the peaceful stillness of a maternity ward between contractions, something else entirely. The kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Carla's hand dropped from the air where she'd been reaching for Matthew. Color left her face in a wave. Her eyes moved to me, then back to him, and in that moment in the space between his question and her silence, I saw it. Not guilt exactly, something more complicated. The expression of someone whose two worlds have just collided and she's watching the damage happen in real time. Where did you? She started. He was here, Matthew said. In this room. He told the nurses he was the father. Carla closed her eyes. When she opened them, she looked at me with something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Something almost like relief. I was going to tell you, she said, and her voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. After the baby was safe, I was going to explain everything. Matthew sat down slowly in the chair beside the bed. The chair where he'd been sitting all morning, holding her hand through contractions, being the good husband he'd always been. Then, explain it now, he said. And she did. Ryan Calloway had been her partner for 2 years before she met Matthew. Not a casual relationship, they'd lived together, shared a lease on a condo in Mississauga, shared a bank account. When things ended, they didn't end cleanly. He had claimed she owed him money from a joint investment. She'd maintained she didn't. It had never been resolved, just set aside, the way painful things get set aside when you're trying to start over. She had met Matthew 6 months after leaving Ryan. She had told herself it was a clean break. She had wanted it to be, but 3 months into her pregnancy, Ryan had found her again. Someone from their old circle, she said, had mentioned seeing her at a Shoppers in Guelph, visibly pregnant. He had shown up at her work. He had texted from a number she hadn't blocked because she didn't know it was him. He had told her the baby might be his, that the timing was possible, that he wanted a DNA test before she brought another man's name into it. Is he right? Matthew asked. His voice was so controlled it frightened me more than shouting would have. Carla looked at him. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know, Matthew. That's the truth. I've been terrified to find out. What followed in that room I will not describe in full, because some moments belong only to the people inside them. But I will tell you that Matthew didn't raise his voice. He didn't leave. He sat in that chair, and he breathed. And he asked the questions that needed asking. And I sat in the corner of that room, not to interfere, but because my son needed someone in his corner quiet, present, steady the way Douglas had always been in mine. The baby came at 11:47 that morning. A boy. 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Dark hair. No opinion yet on anything. Matthew held him first, because whatever else was true, he was in that room, and he was the one with his arms open. I watched my son hold that child, and I thought, whatever the answer turns out to be, that moment is real. That is not something anyone can take back. Ryan Calloway was removed from the hospital by security after Matthew spoke with the nursing staff and explained, calmly and precisely, what had happened. Gerald had already flagged the situation to the charge nurse. Ryan did not make a scene. He left the way he'd arrived, composed, certain of himself, a man deferring, not defeated. The paternity question didn't resolve itself that day. These things take time, a cheek swab, a lab, 2 weeks of waiting that I imagine felt like years for Matthew. I won't tell you what the result was before I'm ready, because I want you to sit with what my son sat with. The uncertainty, the not knowing, the having to love someone or decide whether you could before you had all the information. What I will tell you is what I did in those 2 weeks. I brought food. I showed up at their door on Tuesdays and Thursdays with containers of soup and a willingness to hold the baby so both of them could sleep. I did not ask questions Carla wasn't ready to answer. I did not call my sister and describe the situation over the phone. I did not say I knew something was wrong even though I had known, in the vague, useless way that knowing feels when you haven't got anything solid to hold it up. I sat with Matthew one evening on his back porch, the baby asleep inside, Carla resting, and he said to me, "Dad would know what to do." "Maybe," I said, "maybe not. Your father was a wise man, but he was also human. This would have broken his heart the same way it's breaking yours." Matthew looked out at the yard. The maple tree Douglas had planted the year Matthew was born had gone red and gold, the way it did every October without being asked. "What do I do if he started?" He didn't finish the sentence. "You don't have to decide tonight," I said. "You don't have to decide anything tonight except whether you want more tea." He looked at me, and for a second he was 8 years old again, and I was the person who knew how to make things smaller just by being there. "Yeah," he said, "I'll have more tea." The result came on a Thursday. Matthew called me from his car, parked outside his office on Speedvale Avenue, because he hadn't been able to wait until he got home. The baby was his, biologically, unambiguously, entirely his. I sat down on my kitchen floor, not gracefully, not intentionally, just sat down and pressed my back against the cupboard and put my hand over my mouth. Not because I doubted it, exactly, but because 2 weeks of not knowing does something to you, and the release of it has to go somewhere. "Mom?" Matthew's voice in my ear. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I managed. "I'm absolutely fine. How are you?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I think I will be." What happened next was not simple, and I won't pretend it was. Carla and Matthew had hard conversations, weeks of them, with a counselor in a quiet office on Woolwich Street who apparently had a gift for sitting with complicated things. There was grief in there, and anger, and a lot of what Matthew called going back to the beginning, asking questions about the timeline, about what Carla had known and when, about why she'd waited. Carla had no excuse that made everything right. She knew that. What she had was an explanation, not the same thing, and the willingness to stay in the room while Matthew felt everything he needed to feel. Ryan Calloway sent one text after the results came back. Matthew showed it to me without comment. It said, "Understand, good luck with everything," and that was that. Whatever he'd been hoping for, he stepped away from it. Sometimes people surprise you by doing the right thing, even late, even after. I will not pretend to you that I forgave Carla immediately or completely. Forgiveness, in my experience, is less like a switch and more like a slow thaw. It happens in its own time, and you can't force it without breaking something. What I did was make a decision. I decided that the baby in that house was my grandson, without condition. And I decided that Matthew's marriage was his to navigate, not mine to judge. And I decided that showing up with soup, with the gray wool blanket, with my presence and my silence, when silence was what was needed, was the most useful thing I could do. Douglas used to say that the bravest thing a person can do is stay. Not because staying is easy, but because it's a choice you make over and over, every morning. And some mornings are harder than others. My grandson is 4 months old now. His name is Thomas Douglas Hartwell. The Douglas was Matthew's idea, and I am not ashamed to tell you it made me cry for 20 minutes in the car on the way home from the registry office. He has Matthew's ears and, I am convinced, Douglas's stubbornness, because he absolutely refuses to nap for longer than 40 minutes no matter what anyone tries. I go over on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Sometimes Carla and I have tea after Thomas is settled. We don't talk about Ryan Calloway. We talk about Thomas, and about the garden, and about the show we're both watching on CBC. It is not the relationship I imagined having with my daughter-in-law, but it is a real one, and real, I have learned, is worth more than imagined. Matthew called me last week, just to say hello. We talked for an hour about nothing important. A hockey game, a pothole on Stone Road that's been there since September, whether Thomas is old enough for a stuffed animal that has button eyes. Before he hung up, he said, "Mom, I'm glad you were there that morning. At the hospital. I don't know what I would have done if Gerald hadn't found you first." "You would have managed," I told him. "You're your father's son." "I'm yours too," he said. I held the phone for a long time after we said goodbye. They say a grandmother's instinct is the greatest gift. I spent 2 years pushing mine down because I wanted Matthew to be happy, because I didn't want to be the difficult one, because Douglas's voice in my memory kept telling me not to see shadows where there were none. And maybe he was right, in his way. Maybe what I'd sensed wasn't danger exactly, just a door left open, a thing unfinished. But I was there on the morning that mattered, and I stayed. And my son knows not because I told him, but because some things are just understood between people who love each other, that I will always be there, and I will always stay. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe a mother who's biting her tongue, maybe a grandmother wondering whether to speak up or stay quiet. Leave me a comment. Have you ever had to hold something hard in silence, waiting for the right moment? I'd truly love to hear from you. Proverbs 31:25 says she is clothed with strength and dignity, and she can laugh at the days to come. I have not always felt strong. There were mornings in that 2-week wait when I sat at Douglas's side of the bed and I talked to a man who wasn't there, asking for the patience to do this right. But strength, I've come to believe, is not the absence of fear. It's showing up with the tulips anyway. It's sitting in the corner of a hard room so your son knows he's not alone. It's choosing, every Tuesday and Thursday, to knock on that door. Whatever hard room you're sitting in right now, you are not alone either. Thank you for staying with me until the end.